Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, a contractor supporting Western Area Power Administration and the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. I'm filling in for Randy Mannion as today's webinar chair. Today's webinar, titled Request for Proposal Strategies for Tribal Community Energy Projects, is the 7th webinar of the 2018 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website, along with copies of today's PowerPoint presentations. These will be available in about 1 week. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and recording will be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted for this purpose. We will answer your written questions at the end of all the presentations. You can submit a question at any time by clicking on the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. We will try to keep the webinar to no longer than 2 hours. Let's get started with opening remarks from Lizanna Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and deployment supervisor in the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. Lizanna is responsible for managing technical assistance services, implementing national funding and financing programs, and administering the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has more than 20 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for the last 18 years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and pursued a Master's in Business Administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizanna, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you much, James, and hello everyone. I join James in welcoming you to the 7th webinar in the 2018 series. This webinar series is sponsored by 2 U.S. Department of Energy organizations, the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, Office of Indian Energy for short, and the Western Area Power Administration. The Office of Indian Energy directs, fosters, coordinates, and implements energy planning, education, management, and programs that assist tribes with energy development, capacity building, energy infrastructure, energy costs, and the electrification of Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, the deployment program works within the Department of Energy, across government agencies, and with Indian tribes and organizations to help Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a 3-pronged approach consisting of financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and capacity building. And this webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. Specifically, the webinar series is part of the Office of Indian Energy's efforts to support fiscally responsible energy business and economic development decision-making and information sharing among tribes. This webinar series specifically is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, highlight tribal energy case studies, and identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. In today's webinar, we will focus on the use of requests for proposals, RFPs, for energy development. Attendees will learn how to utilize an RFP and get tips on how to develop one that is effective and attractive to potential bidders. The webinar will also discuss key considerations for tribes when responding to an electric utility RFP for energy development. We hope this webinar series is useful. This particular webinar and the series itself is useful, but we do welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there's ways we can make the series better or if there's particular topics that may be of interest. Before I turn this back over to James, though, I did want to make a couple of announcements and to let everyone know that last week that the Office of Indian Energy did announce a new tribal energy atlas. This atlas was funded by the Office of Indian Energy, and it is the first of its kind interactive geospatial application that will enable tribes to conduct their own analysis of installed energy projects and resource potential on tribal lands. This was developed by researchers from DOE's National Renewable Energy Laboratory for the Office of Indian Energy and it's the most robust tool ever designed specifically to assist tribes, tribal energy planners, technicians, and investors in analyzing options for Indian country. The latest energy resource data was used to populate the tribal energy atlas, along with other relevant information on infrastructure, conventional and renewable energy facilities, transmission lines, railroads, and for environment, the water availability, protected areas, energy efficiency, electricity, natural gas prices, and more. So I do urge you to take a look at that. It is featured on the Office of Indian Energy website at www.energy.gov/Indian Energy, one word. I'd also like to let everyone know that the Department of Energy issued a $2 billion Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program solicitation on July 17th. They issued the first loan guarantee solicitation for the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program under DOE's Loan Program Office. And the solicitation will provide as much as $2 billion in partial loan guarantees to support economic opportunities for Native American and Alaska Native communities through energy development and projects and activities. So if you have questions, I would urge you to contact the Loan Program Office at TELGP at headquarters or at hq.doe.gov. And they've also encouraged tribes and Alaska Native villages to seek a pre-application consultation with the LPO staff. And again, you can use that email address to contact them as well. So again, with that, I would urge you to check out the Atlas, maybe find out information on the loan guarantee program if that's of interest. And with that, I'm going to turn back over to James and to our presenters. Before I do, I want to thank all of our presenters today for giving of themselves, their expertise, and their time to share with you this information. So thank you all.
Thank you, Lizana. On today's agenda, we have 3 presentations from 4 presenters. I will introduce all of the speakers now. Our first speaker is Doug Gagne. Doug is a project analyst at the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He joined NREL after graduating from the University of Denver with a Master's of Business Administration, where he also earned his bachelor's degree in International Policy and French. He has evaluated the transaction structures, valuation, and technical characteristics of projects spanning most conventional renewable energy technologies and brings a robust understanding of solar photovoltaic project costs and financing mechanisms. He also performs data mining and cost analysis for a variety of solar photovoltaic and wind turbine cost benchmarking studies and examines early stage project development considerations for renewable energy and resilience projects. Following Doug, we will hear from John Doherty. John has developed solar PV projects with Sunvest beginning in 2014. His experience is in using data to drive technical system design and performance modeling to yield robust economic analysis to customers. To date, he's been involved with more than 5 megawatts of projects, including residential, commercial, not-for-profit, and utility scale. John has worked on several tribal projects in multiple states. The tribal work has included conceptual design, system siting, grant assistance, budgeting, and project implementation and consumer education. Our final presentation is from Avant Energy, where we will hear from Jim Richardson and Jake Clavin. Jim is Avant's Director of Energy Marketing with over 35 years of experience in the energy industry. At Avant, Jim plays a key role providing energy marketing services to clients. He has extensive experience issuing requests for proposals to various various power supply products and evaluating proposals on behalf of utility clients. Jim also serves on the North American Energy Markets Association Board of Directors. Jake Clavin is a senior manager, Jake Clavin is a senior manager of consulting at Avant. Jake helps communities, utilities, and Native American tribes solve complex problems and pursue opportunities in the power industry. Jake has advised clients on strategic planning, utility formation, project feasibility, cost of service, and rate design. Jake has experience issuing and evaluating power supply proposals on behalf of tribal utilities. So with that, those are our speakers. I will just give me a moment and I will bring up our first presentation from Mr. Doug Gagne.
Thanks, James. So I guess just advance to the introductory slide.
There you go, Doug.
Thank you.
It should be up.
All right, greatly appreciated. So today my name is Doug Gagne, and I'll be giving you kind of an overview of requests for proposals, how to do them. I'll give you some good resources for a template to use, and highlight some best practices in their creation. Next slide. So real quick, I'll just give a quick overview of the National Renewable Energy Lab. The laboratory's research and development focuses on secure domestic energy with economic viability. Today, NREL's groundbreaking advanced energy research and development spans from foundational science to R&D, to discovery and invention of methods, to components and energy delivery systems. So the laboratory's energy analysis informs R&D and results in a national economic impact of $872 million annually. NREL also supports the Office of Indian Energy with the Department of Energy. Next slide. So first, I wanted to just highlight some of the benefits of issuing an RFP and doing a project. These include economic benefits, both workforce development and job training, as well as job creation. There can be land royalties from projects developed. Some tribes have received community funds. Those can include building fire departments, schools, reduced income rates for low-income residents, and finally, economic development in areas can be taxed by certain tribes with the appropriate structures. So I just wanted to highlight that there are some good reasons to do renewable energy, and the RFP process is one of the means to do that. So advancing to the next slide, I'll outline kind of where I'm going today. First I'll start with just explaining what requests for proposals are. Then I'll dive into what tribal RFP template we've developed for tribes to use. This includes a lot of background information and is intended to simplify the RFP process. Then RFP best practices and lessons learned from prior RFPs, and a summary of the slides. Next slide. So first, I just wanted to define what an RFP is, so everybody's on the same page. An RFP is an industry standard document requesting written bids from qualified contractors. It enables buyers to conduct a bidding process to identify the best price and quality for the desired service. So much like you'd go to multiple contractors to, do a, repair or a new build on your home, you want to do the same thing for a renewable energy project to make sure you're getting the best price and quality possible. An RFP is just one step in a very long process to get to an operating renewable energy project, and we'll only focus on the RFP process step today. Next slide. So here is a more detailed overview of how the RFP process unfolds. As I've noted, an RFP is a significant undertaking, and you don't want to embark on that journey until you have a good sense of that it's actually going to materialize. So considering funding sources, if it's going to be a tribally owned project, to pay for the ultimate construction contract, as well as potential fatal flaws. For example, if you need, board of directors to sign off on a project, making sure that that board of directors has buy-in up front will save time and money in the RFP process ultimately. So here's the overview of the process. Each arrow will kind of dive into detail of what that step is and explain, what you have to do at each step to get an RFP completed. Next slide. So to start out, the development of an RFP basically involves the kind of creation of the document itself. They're generally detailed procurement documents, and you need to put enough information in there that vendors will know what the site is and how they can bid on it. So generally telling them your goals, what size and type of system you want to procure, the location of the site so that they have a sense of if they're interested, how they'll be evaluated so that they know how to submit the best possible application to your response to your RFP. And all of the above, again, should be informed by clear project goals. The development of the RFP will ultimately look like a packet of materials that includes all of this information as well as your requirements. The list of things that would be included would be your scope of work, data on the site, both the location as well as potential load information if the project will offset tribal energy building consumption, project logistics, vendor evaluation criteria, and proposed, proposal content requirements. Next slide. So once you've developed the RFP, you need to promote it. There's multiple venues, and I would recommend including multiple venues in your promotion process. There are aggregators who look through, individual websites. So posting it on your homepage is a good decision. Promoting it on social media, but above all, I strongly recommend figuring out who the local vendors or local contractors who might do a project are in your area, and just giving them a heads up that this is something that's coming that you put out there. There's nothing wrong with that, and it'll at least make them aware so that they can decide whether or not they want to respond. Again, with an RFP process, more is always better. Generally, you'll want at least 3 responses, but if you can only get 2, that could be sufficient. I will note, just as a aside, that there always are trade-offs between asking for too much information and getting fewer responses, and not enough information to be able to evaluate. So in that first developing an RFP step, that'll be something you need to think about is how much information do we need to make a good decision? But if we ask for too much, nobody's going to want to go through all that gathering of information in order to respond. So there's a bit of a balancing act there. Next slide. So once the RFP has been issued, you don't just wait for all the responses to come in. People are probably going to have questions. So one of the most important things to do is to designate a point of contact, ideally who was involved in the RFP development, who can field these questions in a timely manner. To the extent possible, you'll want to develop an RFP that's clear, but people may have questions, that things may not be clear in the RFP. So it's really important to be able to answer these questions. Some solutions I've seen when they get a lot of questions from an RFP is you can post a FAQ online and answer some of the most basic ones, so you don't have to respond to every single vendor every single day, as well as answering questions that come in from the vendors. Potentially also hosting a walk of the anticipated site is another good option. So that way vendors can inspect the project site in person. You can meet some of the vendor representatives and get more information that way. Next slide. So once the vendors have responded to your request for proposals, now you get down to the review side of things. So you'll have gotten, a certain number of proposals, and now you'll be set out with the task of determining which one to pick. So many proposals will be of kind of a similar quality, at first glance, but once you dive in, you'll realize that there's quite a bit of detail in each of these RFPs. Everyone's going to try to put their best foot forward, and it'll really be, the goal of the reviewer to tease out what things make one vendor better than another. I strongly recommend having a evaluation process with scoring rubric and very clear scoring criteria ahead of time. That eliminates any questions of fairness and also makes it much, much easier on the reviewer. Because as I said, when you first look at these responses, they're all going to look pretty good. And it'll only be by diving into the details that you'll be able to kind of tease out which of these vendors is really going to provide the best value to you beyond the price. Some considerations in evaluating proposals. The financial health of the vendor is a big one. Their history, how many projects have they done, is another big one. Whether they, have an O&M, operations and maintenance and system monitoring plan, as well as whether they operate projects or have removed projects at the end of their life is another consideration. And finally, I'd add that if you're really struggling to pick between 2 or 3 vendors, follow-up interviews could be useful as a tiebreaker as well. Next slide. So in the final step, identifying, potential contractual sticking points ahead of time is another one of the key goals. As I noted at the beginning, getting buy-in from decision makers is one of those critical things that you can do ahead of time so that you didn't go through this entire RFP process without, ending up making an award. Communicating those contract terms ahead of time is key. And, if you're constrained by legal requirements, consider putting those up front. So that's another big one. Next slide. So finally, one last thing I'd note at the review step would be that tribes can also apply to the DOE Office of Indian Energy for technical assistance for help reviewing applications as well. So if you get a bunch of these RFP responses and they're all 150 pages and they all look the same to you, there is a resource out there to kind of perform that review as well. So I just wanted to highlight that as a potential service that the DOE Office of Indian Energy can provide. So now transitioning to the draft solar RFP template. This is a template that tribes can use to get most of the way towards developing an RFP. So, the key point here is why reinvent the wheel and build an RFP from scratch when you already have a vetted template to work from. So this template requires fairly minimal input from the tribes, mainly just including the project details, like what is the goal, where's the site, what is the scope of work, etc. So tribes seeking to develop, the audience for this template is for tribally owned projects. And I want to really make that abundantly clear because this is not an RFP for power purchase agreement projects. The difference being that tribally owned projects would be a RFP for construction firms to go out and build a project and sell it to the tribe, whereas a power purchase agreement would be for a third party to build and own a project and sell power to the tribes. I did include some considerations for power purchase agreement RFPs listed below. These are kind of key things to consider for negotiating PPAs and things that can result in a better or worse deal for energy deal for tribes, whether the energy price is fixed, or whether it escalates each year, whether that price escalates, how long the PPA is for, and whether the tribe could buy out the project at a certain point in the future. Common buyout terms are often 7 years, 10 years, and then onwards negotiable. There are some legal requirements for buyout terms for vendors, but that's maybe a little in the weeds. But again, I just wanted to point out that there's a big difference between tribally owned projects RFPs and power purchase agreement RFPs. So this highlight of this template will be for tribally owned projects. I will note that several tribes have already used this RFP with success, or at least portions of it, as it covers many of the main considerations and is a good way to vet contractors thoroughly. Next slide. So some of the primary inputs are in blue in the RFP document. Here's an example of the first page. You'll see that the blue text in brackets is generally the inputs. I've summarized what those inputs are throughout the document. The major ones are in that upper bullet, the project details. So what is the site? If the project's going to offset the tribe's energy consumption, what are the electricity loads at those buildings? When might project developers come visit the site? As well as what does the site look like in terms of maps and plans? The other major lift is developing the scope of work. What does the project look like? What are the design considerations? And really, what are the goals for the bidders? And I'll go into that in more detail on the next slide. But I first wanted to just summarize that this is a really powerful tool. It's almost like a RFPs at a high level are like a really, really long checklist where you want to think of every possible thing that could potentially go wrong with a contractor. A lot of that heavy thinking and thinking through that checklist has been done in this document. So I really would strongly encourage folks to use this template so that you don't, go off on your own and potentially forget that, a contractor needs to be licensed to, perform work in your state or needs to be bonded. So there's a lot of important considerations that is hard for one person to think of at one particular time. This has been an iterative process. Next slide. So in summary, I just wanted to summarize some of the best practices as you're developing an RFP. First one being to measure twice and cut once. So issuing an RFP, that's the competitive bidding process. Vendors will follow what you say the evaluation criteria are, and they'll be forced to conform to the goals that you've issued. That said, if you hadn't thought of a potential approach and had talked to the vendor beforehand or had issued a request for information, which moves to the second bullet, they might have been able to make you aware of other project procurement options that you may not have considered. So for example, you may have requested a fixed tilt solar array of exactly 2 megawatts, and a different developer may come in and say, well, if you'd opened up your RFP a little more broadly, I could have bid in at a different type of technology that would have given you a better price or quality. So that's something to consider. Is the issue is, developing an RFP is kind of an art in that you want to get enough information to make a good decision, but you don't want to be too restrictive or ask for so much information that the vendors don't want to respond, which transitions to the third best practice is, again, request enough information, but not so much that vendors don't want to respond, because it would take them, weeks and weeks of time just to respond to the information request. And finally, I want to point out that the goals of the RFP are a really critical part. So there's many, you could set many goals. The most common one is the cost of the system. So you would come out and say, I want the lowest cost system. However, there's trade-offs there. The lowest cost system may not actually provide the most benefit over the course of the lifetime of the project. For example, in that solar example, I used a fixed tilt solar system, may not produce as much energy as one that does tilt on a single axis. So if you used a different metric, like how much will this project save me, you don't have to do as much of that number crunching yourself. The vendors will do that number crunching for you. Or alternatively, you could take it a step further and just say, I want the best production guarantee for a given price. That way, vendors understand that they're on the hook to provide a certain amount of electricity to you each year from that project. And if they don't, there will be, contractual compensation. So it's really important to think beyond just, I want the lowest price, and start thinking towards goals that allow vendors to provide the most value as well. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight a few potential resources. I've already highlighted the RFP template, and the link is included here. For reference, you can also just Google DOE tribal RFP template, and it'll come right up. I've included some other detailed RFP steps that I partially used for this, as well as my own experience, that you can refer back to if you had a question on any specific step. There's some tips from a developer on what they look for in an RFP and what they love and what they hate. And finally, there's a solar decision tree developed by the EPA that will help with some of the RFP evaluation as well. And next slide. And with that, thank you all for your attention. And I'm happy to answer any procedural questions about RFPs at the end of the other presentations as well. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, James.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. Excellent presentation. And reminder to the audience, we will have these presentations available to you, so you can use those links, in about 1 week. So next, we're going to hear from Sunvest Solar to get the EPC's perspective, and Mr. John Doherty. John, it's ready to go.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for being a part of it today. I think my slides not only dovetail nicely with Doug's comments in their blue and yellow design, but also in their in some of the highlighted bullet points. So I will try to not just repeat similar things that have been said. A little bit about Sunvest. If you want to go to the next slide, we're a solar development firm. So what we spend a lot of time doing is helping different entities, tribal entities certainly included, develop projects and bring them from conceptual idea to implemented running solar photovoltaic arrays. So we'll cover a little bit very briefly about kind of solar at a very high level. I just like to make sure that the educational aspect gets touched on as we do presentations like this. And we'll get into what I, as a individual who spends lots of time responding to RFPs, would like to see, and how potentially a project development firm like Sunvest could help with that front end work and developing a successful RFP. Sunvest Solar, to start off, we're headquartered in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, so just near Milwaukee. We're a project development firm, as I mentioned, so we handle basically all aspects of solar design and engineering. We work on procurement and different vendors and do site selection and construction work. We subcontract out the electrical construction, which enables us to work nationwide. So we've done projects in several states across the country, and we can do that work more broadly given our organizational structure. Just a bit about our company. We've certainly worked with DOE and HUD grants before, and certainly understand the technical complexities that are needed, and have helped tribal governments apply to and be awarded those grants. We can help with engineering a solution to pull together a deal, given that just a simple purchase is often not the most economically viable structure. And our company has extensive experience in doing this work, with over $5 million of tribal projects already installed. I'll be very brief here, because I think everyone is at least familiar a little bit about solar, but essentially just to start putting some pictures to all this, solar projects at their basic level are panels, racks, and inverters. So Deployment methods for the photovoltaic panels can be ground mounted, roof mounted. What you see in the bottom left is a ballasted, non-penetrating racking design, which would be typical for us for flat buildings that have membrane roofs, so there's no penetrations to roofs, minimizes impacts to existing roof structure. Projects where land is available, ground mounts are another option. They can be fixed or tracking systems. So again, talking to Doug's comments on what type of technology is best, though it's all going to vary based on system siting and requirements and goals set forth from the tribe. Power is routed always through an inverter, so a solar inverter. Solar panels are generating direct current electricity that needs to be inverted to alternating current to be put into a building. And then the comment about being modular and expandable is just focusing on solar being a solution that can really scale up to, you know, from a small project to quite a large one in order to address energy needs. I think we can probably just briefly touch on how these are long-lived systems. This is what I want to kind of come here, and this again speaks to Doug's comments previously that it's a lot to consider when you go out and want to put forth an RFP and do a solar energy project. You know, we typically think of a solar lifespan as 30 years for a project, and kind of looking at that holistically, not only the cost to build it, but also to maintain it and to you know, deal with it at end of system life and beyond are important considerations to go through, and that we'll talk to kind of the educational component and the maintenance component as we move through the slides. So here I want to take kind of these bullet points one by one and kind of just thinking about myself as someone who responds to these documents, what helps our company and myself choose to take on an RFP response, and also, you know, be effective in getting responses that you can consider. So to the first bullet point here, to lower the barrier for responses. James, if you can just jump to the next one, sorry. So this is very much reiterating what Doug previously mentioned, but the upfront work before an RFP is put out is hugely important. Basically, the theme of my entire presentation is the kind of more clear and your goals are and your RFP is, the better responses you're going to get from the vendors, and the, you know, more successful your project's likely to be. So doing that design work, I'm going to address kind of in the second half of my presentation, because there are quite a few components that go into that. But one that for me is so often just not thought about is facility information. So understanding, you know, if you want to offset usage at a particular building, seeing what is the service at that building, what is the usage, looking at consumption history, all that's going to be rolled up by a developer or someone responding to an RFP to help understand what the best system for you is. If that work can be done ahead of the RFP being issued, that again lowers the barrier to make a response that much easier, instead of having to do that kind of design work up front and by every single vendor that's planning to respond. The next bullet point here, being clear about your goals and what you will and won't consider. Certainly as a respondent, we have ideas since we deal with solar on a day-to-day basis. And so if we see an RFP that we feel clearly there's a more economically advantageous way to implement a project, or something that may be missed given utility regulation or something of that nature, having a way for a responder to offer an alternative, we feel is very important. So those things can be caught, and you know, the value of someone who deals with solar day in and day out can be shown through. On the flip side of that coin, and this kind of speaks to the previous bullet point, but the more clarity that exists in an RFP, the more upfront work that's been done, the less uncertainty there is for the respondent, and that allows responders to give a better price. Because every time there's uncertainty in a project, whether it's, you know, what type of service you need to connect to, what is the timeline for the project, when material would need to be purchased, deadlines, all those things, if there's uncertainty, basically builds into the price, because you have to try to mitigate risk as a responder. The next bullet point here, to minimize games respondents try to play. this aspect, again, speaks to doing more development work on the front end before an RFP is issued. Essentially, you know, when comparing respondents, you want to try to have a comparison that's equal across the different metrics. And, you know, if you're unfamiliar with solar and how things work, you can oftentimes see that, you know, certain things like, for example, I put in here, production estimates might be very high. So, you know, the financial benefits of a solar array are based on how much energy it generates and when. So being confident in what to expect from a system, and then the scale changing is important up front, because then you can properly evaluate if you know, some things might be too good to be true from a particular respondent, and being able to identify that and you know, catch it before moving forward is a powerful thing. On that topic, remove, if possible, financial analysis from responses. This again kind of speaks to the lowering the barrier for responses. Without a pretty detailed picture of your specifics as an entity, it's, you know, financial analysis is a very data heavy undertaking, and so if everything isn't known, it's hard for a respondent to be accurate. And certainly there are a lot of factors that if it left the respondent to you know, make their own guess or kind of pick numbers themselves, it's going to be very difficult to compare one to the other when you look at multiple responses. So oftentimes doing the design work for what system you want to build, then you can compare price across the different vendors and compare the vendors, you know, across each other for who you'd rather work with, without having to worry about different games that could be played to make their response look more economically advantageous. The next slide here is exactly what Doug previously mentioned. As a bidder, I certainly want to understand what is important in a bid. Of course, price is always going to be a major factor, but understanding what other criteria are heavily incentivized might determine when, you know, projects you may or may not bid for if you're not strong there. So if you know, there are plenty of examples, but if there are multiple site visits and they need to be all attended and it's remote, that might make it more difficult to respond, and you want to make sure that you're not going to spend resources as a developer going after a project that you're, you know, basically can't win if you don't do certain things. So being upfront about that will help responders, again, minimize their risk and offer a very strong bid to be considered. Secondarily, this again speaks to lowering sort of barriers for response. Oftentimes, I feel that there is so much information requested in a bid that has to get pulled together, and if you're, you know, not in the couple lowest bidders, you're, you know, basically kicked out immediately, which is fine. But doing that extra work for not being, you know, heavily considered, it makes it more difficult to go after and respond to a bid. So having a system where you might take the top 3 candidates based on a rubric and then bring them in for an interview, or, you know, ask for additional details, more complicated, you know, criteria for previous projects to consider, looking for references, those types of things will help broaden the pool for who can respond to your RFP. The final point, having deadlines for the project. This speaks to the risk for a developer. So, you know, everyone has their project pipeline moving for, you know, the given year and the year ahead and what have you. Understanding where the project will fit into, you know, when the actual build will happen, what the kind of timeline between the finalizing of the RFP and getting a response, then moving forward. Shortening up those timelines, or at least enumerating those timelines, will make it easier for the respondents to plan accordingly and offer the most competitive pricing. So to take this kind of at a different angle, I wanted to make sure I was addressing, as a respondent, what do I like to see? So that was the previous set of slides there. This is a pitch basically for development or partnering with a development firm that can help kind of address all these many different concerns and kind of bring a project from idea to implementation, offering some help. So here are the kind of 5 things we would offer as items to think about as a project is starting to become a reality. The first factor is tribal leadership. So this, again, coming back to exactly what Doug said, Getting the tribal leadership involved, right from the start is hugely important, because if a project can't move forward, even if all the objectives are hit after it's been devised, it's not going to go anywhere. So that eliminates a lot of wasted time for all parties involved. Similarly, getting the rest of involved parties. So we see everything from facilities, staff at government or educational, or the labor force. All these things, the earlier you can kind of involve them in the process, or keep a communication channel open, the more smooth the entire process from before the RFP is generated to a functioning solar system, the smoother that becomes. The biggest thing to do that is just be very open about communication. So I know we've had very good success with community education events where we would come out and talk with any interested member of a tribal community to not only explain what the technology is, the benefits, how things work, but answer questions and certainly just spend the time making sure there are no surprises for any party who's gonna be around this project. Makes things more smooth. The second thing to consider is who to partner with. So this certainly speaks to when an RFP is issued and then a partner is chosen to build a project. But I would argue that before that, there's also an important step here, thinking about, and this is not SunVest specific, but this would be any development partner, thinking about a project before an RFP is generated. So someone like our company would help with all these enumerated process here. So, having an economic analysis done, understanding where solar makes the most sense to implement, understanding the different technical components about interconnecting with different utilities, what incentives may be available, applying for those incentives to help offset a cost and kind of open up the possibility for a larger project, doing that grant submission work. All that can be done with a partner ahead of time before an RFP to build a project is issued. Or, for example, you could do an RFP for the development portion of a solar project as a separate entity, and then make that choice, and then have that development partner act as an owner's representative to help implement and smooth out the rest of the process. So you could see a system of partner with a developer for a solar project, and then have that developer help with an RFP for an installer for the project. And potentially a firm like SunVest could do both, but he certainly doesn't have to. You can have multiple firms involved for a project implementation. The project goals, and this is just some food for thought because it's clearly something that needs to be thought about. But the more clear the project goals are, the better respondents can be to an RFP, and the better a developer can be in helping guide what the project needs to do, and who needs to be involved, and what decisions need to get made. So some things to think about that I think often maybe because obviously the economic return is going to be the primary driver. So the savings, what does solar offer in terms of clean, reliable energy, but also safety concerns, addressing education in the community, and hopefully creating jobs in the community as a long-standing portion to operate or maintain the solar array. We've certainly seen that as a pretty massive benefit for tribes looking at their large deployments. I'm going to reiterate the implementation timeline because so often as a responder, this is the part that is difficult for us. So if we don't understand when a project is going to get built, or what the steps are between an RFP being issued and the expectation for generating power, that introduces tons of risk and again a price change from our perspective. So doing that work ahead of time, or at least enumerating what steps would need to be done so everyone responds in an equal fashion, is an important aspect, because timing does matter. Different incentives are available or not available. There are different rules that come into play over time. All these changes are kind of a fluid market, and so making sure that respondents are going to provide the system that's going to work will minimize the risk of having, for example, massive changes to a project once it's awarded. And the final point I wanted to touch on is I kind of alluded to this earlier, but you know, a solar project is a pretty kind of large process that's going to involve multiple people or multiple components. Of course, those components can be kind of under one roof, one firm, one company, but they might also not be. And so, you know, it might help to have a developer that can address the financier components, the engineering components, the installation components, and the operation and maintenance components. Those are all going to be factors for a project. And, you know, it's a lot to take on as any entity who doesn't deal with solar on a day in and day out basis, but to understand that, you know, there are people out there who want to help with this, with these projects and, you know, make the most economically advantageous and, you know, deployment of solar possible. That's the group there. The next step slides is just for anyone out there who's, you know, really interested in moving forward. You know, identifying the sites where solar is going to make sense is the primary kind of first driver to what a project would look like. And doing that work, you know, can be internalized if there's available resources for staff. But it also is something that, you know, there are project development firms like Sunvest who would happily do, you know, for any interested party. So it's, again, I'm trying not to sound like I'm pitching for Sunvest specifically, because of course you could work with anyone, but know that these resources are available to you, you know, in the marketplace. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you, John. Appreciate that. And last slide here is the contact information for John. And as a reminder, you can grab all this information once we post the slides in a week or so. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to go to a little different perspective. It's going to be looking at RFPs and from a different standpoint. So now we're going to look at tribes responding to RFPs, and a specific type of RFP here we're focusing on is RFPs for energy supply, so utilities looking for energy. And with that, we're going to hear from Avant Energy and Jake and Jim. So with that, Jake and Jim, it looks like we're all set.
Well, thank you very much, James, for having us. And as James mentioned, my name is Jake Lavin. I'm a senior manager at Avant Energy, and I'm in our consulting department. I have a background in engineering and business, and I actually started my career in the nuclear power industry, where I was working on very large 2,000 megawatt, you know, very much utility scale projects where you are pumping a lot of power onto the grid. Since then, I've focused more now on working with tribes and cities and publicly owned utilities, working more on community scale projects. So I do a lot of strategic energy planning, kind of community-sized project feasibility, and I also work on utility feasibility studies here at Avant. As James mentioned, our presentation here is kind of a different perspective. So whereas the first two presentations we heard from, they're talking about tribes, you know, potentially issuing RFPs. Here we're talking about an opportunity for a tribe to potentially respond to an RFP issued by a local utility that is looking for power. So, you know, our goal here is to kind of put you inside the brain of one of those utilities that's issuing a power supply RFP. And I'm joined here by Jim Richardson, who will jump on later in this presentation to go through that process. So with that, James, you can jump to the next slide. Real quick about Avant, we primarily serve tribes, public power utilities and power agencies, and cities. We've been in business for around 30 years, and I think one thing that I want to point out is that we have a unique blend of experience. It spans consulting, project development, and then utility management and operations. So I think that diverse perspective really helps us kind of look at the long-term value of energy projects for tribes and communities. Some of the things we do strategic long-term planning for utilities, as well as some of the daily utility operations like scheduling generation assets into the market. We also manage public power agencies. So these are groups of publicly owned utilities that are working together to get some economies of scale when it comes to generating and buying power. And we also build and operate plants on behalf of our clients. And I think one thing that's unique for this conversation is that we understand both the wholesale and retail side of the market. So with community scale projects, and a lot of the energy projects tribes have done, they're typically smaller projects where you're using the power that's generated on your reservation. So essentially you're offsetting what you have to purchase from the local utility. And to understand those projects, you really have to understand the retail side of the business. But for some of the projects we're going to be talking about in this presentation, these are larger utility scale projects where you're actually selling power to the grid. And for looking at those projects, you need a very good understanding of the wholesale market. And Avant is very much involved in both of these markets. So with that, James, you can go to the next slide. The outline for the presentation, I'm going to quickly just touch on why this matters for tribes. And then Jim is going to take you over and walk you through the process utilities take for issuing and evaluating one of these power supply RFPs. Lastly, we're going to finish up with some of the key points for tribes leaving this presentation to take home to leadership or their energy planning department. Next slide. So why does all of this matter to tribes? I think the first point is that I think a lot of tribes actually know this stat where although tribal lands only make up around 2% of the total land base in the United States, they have a disproportionate amount of the renewable potential in the country, around 5% of the total renewable potential in the US. So there is a significant energy development potential on tribal land. And to take full advantage of this energy potential, tribes have to do more than just use this energy on reservation. That's still a great, get in the door type energy project where you're developing rooftop solar or a community scale solar project. But to really take advantage of the tribal energy potential, there will need to be some large utility scale projects where that power is actually sold to the grid. It's sold to buyers off reservation. And one option to do this is to look at these electric utility RFPs. These are concrete opportunities where a tribe is issuing an RFP to the world saying, I need power. Do you have it? And can you deliver it to me? So again, the focus of this presentation will be on that opportunity, and we'll try to connect it to tribes as much as possible. But before we move into that, I did just want to know, a tribe that maybe wants to develop a large utility scale project, you don't have to wait for one of these RFPs to be issued. You may want to also consider a reverse RFP, and a reverse RFP is an RFP that the tribe would issue that says, I have a large scale, utility scale project that I want to sell to the grid. Please give me your best numbers in terms of buying this power from me. Again, that's not the focus of this presentation, but that is definitely an option to consider if you're interested in these large projects, and feel free to reach out to me or Jim about that. So with that, next slide. I think all this is particularly relevant because of what Lizana brought up at the beginning of this webinar, which is that the DOE last week announced an exciting loan guarantee program, and this is a program that can be used for large utility scale projects. And to be ready to go after this solicitation, you need to have a project in mind. And if that project is a large project, you need to have a buyer in mind. And so again, what we're doing here is putting you in the brain of a utility that potentially wants to buy power. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jim, and you can go to the next slide, James.
Thanks, Jake. This is Jim Richardson, and just to recap, like Jake, I started the nuclear business, although much longer ago, probably 40 years ago. I've been working with primarily public power utilities for the last 35 years, and during that time, I've developed, written, and responded to any number of RFPs for different projects and different products and seen the changes in the market for RFPs. So we thought what we do is try and better, especially for the tribes, try and better explain the utility process for an RFP. Because if you're going to respond to an RFP, it's always good to know what they're looking for so you can hit the target. And with this new program, I think that's especially important that tribes understand the utility power supply planning process. So what really is that? Well, the first part is regulated utilities, they must file an IRP with the respective public utility commissions. Public utilities, say municipals or electric cooperatives that aren't public utility commission jurisdictional, they're not PUC jurisdictional entities, they don't have to file, but most public utilities and most large co-ops develop their own form of IRP to facilitate the planning process and their objectives there for the scope of their system. It's just the smart thing to do. So what utilities are typically doing with their integrated resource plan is they're forecasting their future load, which I will tell you today, load forecasting is getting much more complicated. The end customer, whether it's retail, consumer, or industrial customers, they're always looking for ways to cut their load, cut their expenses. So that is wreaking havoc with long-term load forecasting. The other thing they're trying to do is identify potential resource options to meet the future loads once they do have a forecast in place. And that aspect is also evolving rapidly, because if you went back 20 years, everybody wanted to build a coal plant or maybe a gas plant if there was a pipeline available. Now what you're seeing more and more often is more renewable projects. The focus has been on, recently has been on renewables and maybe gas for base load. The third thing they're trying to do is determine the optimal mix of resources, and that's they're optimizing between reliability, cost, and then their environmental goals, which are becoming more and more important. And they're also looking to, what they do with all that is they create and implement a resource plan, right? And what that does is answer the question, how will they meet the goals of their integrated resource plan? Because that plan, once they file that plan with the Public Utility Commission, the PUC will either tell them, okay, that's fine, or they'll ask them to make adjustments. But anyway, that plan has to be approved. So then they have to create an implementation plan to carry out what they've told the Public Service Commission they're going to do. Utilities have many options to match their supply to demand. And basically, you can break it down to, on the supply side, they can either build new generation, or they can purchase power through what's called a purchase power agreement, or a PPA. On the other side, they can impact their demand with efficiency projects and demand response programs. Those are very bespoke to a utility based on where they are, what their loads are, what their customer makeup is. So we won't talk about that at all. That's something we talk about some other time, but they're sometimes horribly complicated. But at the end of the day, utilities have to meet their load and reserve requirements, either through building generation or through a PPA. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a recent integrated resource plan. This is Arizona Public Service, and it's a good example of how utilities use an optionality to meet their long-term goals. And I understand here this is 2014 through 2029, so that's a 15-year look. And I would get you to focus on the 2029 circle there, which is focuses on two components: new utility scale resources, which, and we're looking at over 6,000 megawatts of additional planned resources there. But 70% of those that will come from new utility scale resources, and of that 90% through natural gas plants. And if you look at the B section, which is the new customer resources, that's significant. That's something that 15 or 20 years ago, you would not have seen anything that size, right? So 1,400 megawatts of energy efficiency projects and distributed energy. The bottom line here is that utilities are making substantial investments in their systems in the coming decade. In this case, it's over $13 billion just by this one utility. Next slide, please. Thank you. I always say if you want the best answers, you have to ask the right questions. And typically, utilities will put a lot of effort into an RFP so that the result is offers that are a good fit with their IRP their integrated resource plan objectives. Key components of that would be the resource type. What is called for in the IRP? What did they plan for? What did they tell the Public Service Commission they want? What did the Public Service Commission tell them they could have? So is that base load? Is that renewables? Those will be identified in their RFP. Delivery. What is the cost to deliver to get the power to their system? What are the difficulties? Do they have to build transmission? Is it can they get it delivered into a point in their system which makes the most sense to cure congestion problems? The successful RFPs, and I can't stress this enough, a successful RFP tends to clearly identify the minimums, what they absolutely have to have, and require standardized responses to those key points to facilitate a fair comparison of responses, but also allow those respondents to offer their strengths. And that's a tough balance to do an RFP that way, because you want to make sure, what you don't want to do is compare a bunch of apples and oranges and every other kind of fruit. You want to compare on the things that you absolutely need. You want to compare apples to apples, but you also want to allow the respondents to demonstrate their strengths, because that's going to help you make that decision. Okay. And quite often, a utility, they want to cast a very wide net. So they want to distribute this RFP to a very large audience to encourage participation and competitive responses. It is not a good thing to get one or two responses to an RFP. And there's different ways to do that. For example, some utilities may enlist, they will distribute an RFP by a direct email campaign or some other forum. One way that utilities do that is use an organization like the North American Energy Markets Association, NAMA, to distribute an RFP. And for NAMA's members, they will distribute the RFP to over 700 targeted recipients in the energy market at no charge. And they all get, and it's important, they all get it at exactly the same time. That's one way. There's multiple ways to do it. You may want to target, depending on what type of project you're going after, you may want to target your recipient market more, or you may want to cast a very wide net. But typically for a large RFP, for large projects, utilities will want to get as many quotes as they can. Next slide, please. And again, at the end of the day, it's all about responsibility of the ratepayers for a utility. They are bound to deliver projects at the lowest possible cost. A utility issuing an RFP is more concerned with what is being offered in a response than who is offering it, assuming it's a qualified respondent, of course. Key priorities are always price, the system benefit, and deliverability. And the system benefits really is an intermittent project, is a dispatchable project. What do they need in terms of how can they manage their system? Again, the interconnection costs on delivery. It's also delivery point. Where's the injection point? What does that do to congestion on their system? The interconnection costs, how far away is the project from their system? What costs are going to be incurred in terms of building new transmission? System impact costs, that's something a lot of folks don't consider, they don't think about, but if you inject a large amount of power into a system, say pick for example an RTO like MISO, you inject a large amount of power in one spot that is going to cause congestion issues or can cause congestion issues somewhere else in the system. So a system impact study will always have to be done which will take a look at the impact on the entire system of that new resource being included and connected at that point. And there may be some upgrades, maybe not even on the utility system that have to be upgraded to handle that that new injection. And then there's always the transmission costs, building new transmission lines, particularly if you're in a non-RTO in a bilateral market. There's a transmission tariff that will have to be included in the so all those things, I bundled them under transmission costs, but all those things come under delivery. All that has to be calculated and those costs identified by the utility to determine what the value of the project. There's also take a look at the risks associated with any project, and each of those have to be considered. There's financing and credit risk. How strong is the counterparty? How strong is the construction company? What type of credit is being used? There's development risks. Will the project actually be developed? Are there problems with permitting? And I'll skip project economic life for a second because I want to spend a little more time on that. But there's the congestion costs we talked about, the legal and regulatory tax policy. Those, as everybody knows, those tend to change. They've been changing rather quickly. If anybody tells you they know what tax policy is going to be in the next 5 years, they're wrong. They don't know. But all those things impact the project cost, and that gets back to that project economic life. It used to be, I've been doing this for a long time, but it used to be that you could build a project and it was, if you did it right, it made good economic sense for 20 years or longer, right? That time horizon is shrinking because the pace of change in developments in the of technologies are changing. So as I mentioned before, if you built a gas plant 20 years ago, that was great, but now all of a sudden you've got all this wind that didn't exist 20 years ago. You have all this solar that didn't exist 5 years ago. You have the battery technologies that didn't exist 3 years ago that are all taking their place in the market, and they're all changing the market price for power in a given location. And that impacts, if you've got a fixed price project, if you've got a project with escalator, it is all impacting what I call the project economic life. So those are risks. You bundle all that together, those are the risks that a utility is looking at when they evaluate a response to their RFP. Those are all components of it. And then, of course, there's environmental considerations. And typically, not even with utilities, but, and let me digress here for a second, there are large corporations, what we call corporate industrial customers, C&I customers. Those folks are beginning to come to the market also. It's not just a utility. You may see somebody like Microsoft or Facebook or Anheuser-Busch or Walmart come to the market and say, I want to buy 100% green power and I want it delivered here. And that is a whole other layer of complexity because those folks want to act like a utility and they're not a utility and they don't quite understand the differences. So they're getting good at it, and for example, Microsoft just got their power marketing license, so they're a licensed power marketer. So that's how things are changing. Next slide, please. Key differences in offers, and I've put together, basically I broke it down into four buckets, if you will. There's the physical characteristics what's the technology? Is it a gas plant? Is it a combined cycle? Is it a peaker? Is it wind? Is it solar? Is it battery? If it is a fuel, what kind of fuel is it running? Can it use? Is it natural gas with oil backup? Is an IC engine? Any of these things. So then you get, if it's a fueled plant, you get delivery considerations on fuel, right? For deliverability on your project, the deliverability, what I mean is, can it get from point A to point B? How hard is it to take a particular project, a particular location, and get it tied into the grid for the customer benefit, for the utility benefit? And that goes back into the infrastructure requirements we talked about. The stages of development, what stage are you in? This is particularly important. Do you own the site? Do you have control of the site? Do you have the proper permits? Have you done the interconnection studies, system impact studies, the financing aspects, operational characteristics of the plant? Is it dispatchable or not? What's the availability of the energy? Is, particularly like with batteries, ramp rates and cycling features, those tend to impact battery dependent projects. Take a look at the RTO requirements, for example, with batteries. The RTOs now are in the process of developing regulations and rules that govern how batteries are offered into the market. So that's still an unknown. Those projects, those technologies are being offered into the market and being offered in RFPs, and the rules are still being written for them. Contractual arrangements, it all comes down to allocation of risk. Who's wearing the risk for which part of the project? The structure of payments, is it a fixed price? Is it have an escalator? There's any number of ways that those can be set up, and the utilities are looking at that. How do they monetize that and fit that into their plans? What services are provided by who, and then maintenance capabilities. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's an example of a recent solar RFP, and it yielded an extremely wide range of products and prices. This type of result can be very challenging to properly evaluate, and you can see here you got some fixed price, you got some price with escalators, you got some with battery compound storage capacity added onto it. Any number of that mix there is pretty difficult to evaluate, and you want to, what's important for a tribe is to provide a clear response that matches the RFP target. That's a distinct advantage so that you don't get lost in the mix like this. Next slide, please. Oh, can I get to the next slide?
Yeah, this is James. It looks like we're having a little bit of a hold up here. I've advanced it on this end. All right, it should be coming through now.
Oh, there we go. There we go. And then last little bit, I'm going to talk about maybe one or two more slides. Selection and negotiation. RFPs are very, very competitive. Give you an example, recent RFP, Xcel Energy received more than 230 responses from a wide range of competitors offering different products. Typically, utilities, the offers are ranked based on the value of the utility, obviously, but those three bullets right there, the duration of the value, because of the rapidly changing market dynamics, utilities have to consider that the duration of value in a particular project is shrinking. Markets have always changed, right? They always have, but that pace of change is increasing, so that factors in. And again, regulatory policy and tax incentives, those things are changing, and they're changing what utilities are required to do and what their responses are. So all those things factor in on top of price and everything else. But one of the things that any respondent, tribe included, has to consider is that the lowest cost approach for utility might just be a self-build option, and it may seem you know, you may be disappointed when you respond to an RFP and you've got a very attractive offer, and then the utility says, well, thank you very much, but I'm going to build this myself. It's not that they were just looking for pricing. They are required to take the lowest cost approach by the Public Utility Commission, and that's really what they're supposed to be doing anyway. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide, I promise, because I can go on forever, and I don't want to do that. But key takeaways for tribes is that larger projects require selling off reservation. That's a given. You know, one option, selling off reservation, is to is to respond to utility RFP. Utilities are seeking competitive offers that they fill a resource requirement. That is what they have to do, right? And it's best to tailor your offer to as best you can to actually meet that resource requirement. Offers your competitive pricing and delivery. That is a package, pricing and delivery, and minimize the risks. Keys here are that tribes seeking to respond to RFPs should, number one, understand the tribe's advantages. What are your big advantages? Land, is it resources, is it infrastructure, is it location? Whatever that is, make sure you bring that to the forefront. That's what's going to separate you from the other offers. Begin now to identify costs to deliver to liquid pricing hubs. Those processes take time. They take some investment to identify those, all the studies that have to be done. So you don't want to wait for an RFP to be issued to begin that process. Identify your potential project sites and consider creative business models and contractual arrangements to go with it. Those second and third bullets, those are very site specific, and those are long lead time items that should begin now. The last bullet is developing relationships with experienced developers. If this is something that you don't have experience with, having someone that does have experience can help you speed through those issues. The last, and what I'll leave you with is this: responding to an RFP is not overly complicated. That process is not overly complicated. All the work required to position a tribe to respond to an RFP is. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jim and Jake. Great presentation. Appreciate that. And now we'll move on to questions from the audience. Remember, audience, you're welcome to submit questions directly via your webinar control panel. Click on the question button and type in the question, and I'll read it to our panelists. And with that, I'll start with a couple questions we have here. But like I said, audience, keep the questions coming if you have them. Hold on one moment. Let me just bring up our general slide here. All right. So one question was, how do we obtain a copy of the slides? You know, one of the best ways to do that is just go to this website or go to the the Office of Indian Energy website and look at their the link for their webinars, and in about 1 week the link to this specific month's webinar will have the slides and an audio version of the presentation that you can rewatch on it. You know, if failing that, you can email myself or Randy Mannion, who you received an email from in regards to registering to this webinar, and he can put you in touch with me, and I'll get you the slides if for whatever reason you need them in a earlier fashion. More specific questions. Let's see here. One caveat I'd like to add is, so far we've had, presentations specific to solar RFPs. Obviously, RFPs can be used for other energy development projects. It seems to me that solar is particularly well suited for that, and so you know, we had 2 solar presentations, but it's important to keep in mind that other energy development can also use RFPs. A general question for the panels here, and this is more on the project development side. Is there, you know, a recommended timeline for the duration that the RFP is advertised, and you know, before the response deadline? Is there, you know, kind of high level guidance on that?
I would say typically what I see is a month timeline is enough to turn things around. I mean, if it's a very large scope and there's, you know, I'm thinking of, like, say you're doing a ground mount and you need to have some time to go do a geotechnical analysis. If that isn't done ahead of time, you'd need more time to pull some of that together. But if RFP is issued and you know, quite specific, I would say a month is plenty of time for a respondent to pull together with their response and submit it. Again, I think Doug mentioned this earlier, but reaching out ahead of time, saying an RFP is coming, can make that, you know, process easier for everybody as well. You know, just surprising something a week before it's due makes it hard to put together a good response.
Great, thank you. A related question to my comment earlier. Is there any guidance on, and once again, this is RFP issuance for project development, is there any guidance on projects that are well suitable for, or well suited for RFP type solicitations, or ones to stay away from? Is there any thoughts from the panel on that?
I can jump in again. Part of it comes down to, you know, utility rules. You know, Sean and Jake talked a lot about, you know, the utility coming to do a project, which is something to consider too. But if it's what we term behind the meter or self-consumed energy, you know, understanding where you have appropriate resources, be that available land for a ground array or you know, viable rooftop space. Those are the first considerations to see that a project can make some sense. But utility rules and interconnection procedures is another part of that, because that's going to really drive the economics of a project. So having a conversation with the utility, but oftentimes we find they don't necessarily, you know how to go about things the best way for a customer in terms of their own generation projects. Talking with and learning about the utility rate structures and rules is an important step.
Great, thank you. Another question here says, how can a tribe enhance their share of the rewards in a utility scale project? Maybe, and I'm guessing.
This is I would say number one is make sure that you have, you know, something that people are really interested in bidding on, and do a good job, you know, kind of selling that up front. So to the extent that you can, you know, do your due diligence and do some of that early design work, that's attractive to developers, because they don't know that they don't have to do that now, and that minimizes the risk. So to give you a short answer, I would say, you know, make sure that you do your homework and get something that looks pretty attractive to developers, so you get more people bidding on it, and that should help you get a better response. You know, as I noted in that first slide, you know, this is a little after RFP, but when you get into that contract negotiation step, you know, their developers are often, especially at larger scales, willing to make concessions around, you know, job creation, school building, things like that, and public community buildings. So just be aware that that's a thing that is done, and that can be a way to extract a little more value as well.
Yeah, this is Jim Richardson again. I think just to add to that, at the end of the day, what I think tribes have to do is understand what the value of their resources are up front, and what the costs are to deliver energy from a tribal project to the buyer. So if you know what that price is, then you understand where you're going to place in an RFP. And I think at the end, one way to do that is you've got to understand your interconnection costs. You got to understand your system impact costs. All those things can be done, and that's typically not going to change much. So once you understand those costs, then what we mentioned before, one way to do that is with a reverse RFP, and go to the market with basically saying, look, I can provide, 10, 50, 100, 200 megawatts worth of solar or wind. I have all these resources. I have this land. I can provide them, and I can deliver to any one of these points. Here's the interconnection study that's been done. This is the transmission study that's been done. Preliminaries. This is what these would cost. What will you pay? And that is really the function of a reverse RFP, is to go out and attract bidders, that the utility bidders or corporate bidders for that energy, that resource.
Thanks, Jim. That's an interesting point. And to follow up on that, actually, I did have a related question, and that is, what stage should a project be at before issuing either a reverse RFP or potentially, responding to an actual utility power supply RFP? And is that kind of the same stage in product development for either scenario, or can you issue one earlier than another in general terms?
If you're going to respond to a utility RFP, typically they're looking at something that starts a few years out. So what they're going to want to see is, it's difficult to respond if you don't know what your costs are, because they're gonna ask for a price. And if you don't know what it costs to deliver the energy, or to produce it, and deliver the energy to a agreed upon delivery point, then it's really difficult to respond to that RFP. You can add in some blanks and say, okay, I don't have permits, I don't have a site study, I don't have interconnection study, I don't have a transmission study, I don't have any of these things, but I have the ability to cite X amount of wind or solar or whatever the resource. I have that. Some utilities will take a look at that and say, that might be attractive to me. I'll work with you to kind of meet in the middle and figure that out. That is not necessarily going to be a winning strategy, because most utilities have a timeline they want to hit. On the other hand, if you do if you've gone and done some of that homework up front, then when a utility lets out an RFP, you are prepared to say, look, I've got these 3 or 4 things done, right? I know what those costs are. I don't know what this fourth cost is rather, and but here's how close we are. That's going to be a much more successful approach, and it puts you also in a line to issue an RFP. That's. I hope that answers the question. I might have gone around in a little circle there, but it is kind of you can come at it 2 different ways, and it is not a black and white answer, because it depends on what a particular utility's goals are and what their timeline is. They may need to do something right now, right? Or they may need to do something that's part of their integrated resource plan that's, it's a 15-year plan or a 10-year plan. They may look at something that's, their needs right now, and they'll look at something that they need to do 6, 7 years from now and see where that fits in. So there's time to take care of that.
Yeah, and this is Jake. I would just add, I think a lot of it comes down to risk too. I mean, the more you can get farther down the development path, the more you're bracketing risk, both from the utility's perspective, in terms of showing them that you have the capability and have done the homework to get this project done, but also from the tribe's perspective, because you're committing to selling that power at a price. And the more homework you've done on that, the more assurance you have around your capability to deliver it at that price.
Gotcha. Thanks, guys. That's helpful. Actually, kind of a related question. Is there a way that tribes can kind of feel out if there is a utility RFP out there? The likelihood of them being a viable candidate. basically only responding if they're in the ballpark of potentially winning the bid? Is there ways they can fill that out in advance, or do you just have to kind of go through the process and see how it shakes out?
Yeah, this is Jim again. There are a number of RFPs. Particularly, you can use the internet to identify issued RFPs and responses. Sometimes on the Public Utility Commission websites, those are out there, so you can get some. We showed you a couple of results there that are publicly available. It's not any proprietary information there, so you can use that. Also, for example, with NAMA that I mentioned, North American Energy Markets Association, I've had 3 RFPs come across my desk this month out there. So there are sources to get on the distribution lists for RFPs. There are a number of ways you can get a hold of those. Obviously, getting one, getting them on timely manner works well, and getting on that distribution list is a great way to go.
Thanks, Jim. Another question here that may need clarification. It says, what if a tribe is seeking project financing from a local family office and not seeking to participate in the loan guarantee solicitation? So I guess I don't know if anybody can respond to that. It doesn't sound like a specific question to me. Peter,
yeah, I think it's kind of related to projects finance risk. So again, as utilities are reviewing proposals for power, they're going to be looking at your ability to get together the finance. And another aspect there is just the cost of capital. So tribes who actually have, are sitting on a good amount of cash and can bring more equity into projects, the cost of capital on that project is lower. That can lead to more competitive, overall rates that you can sell to the utility looking for power. This loan guarantee program was just announced last week, and I think the details of that will come out, and I'm sure there'll be additional webinars through the DOE to explain that in more detail. That does seem to be, related to bringing private financing to some of these tribal energy projects. I think the main takeaway, though, is a tribe, if it desires to go after some of these large utility scale projects, they should look into different financing mechanisms. Whether that's a family loan office or this tribal loan guarantee program, they should find ways to secure the financing at, competitive cost of capital.
Great, thank you. Let me see here. Another question related to the energy supply RFP response. How much time and cost might it take to respond to an energy supply RFP?
That's a very loaded question because it depends on the RFP, how much detail. It depends on how much work's been done. If you're dealing with an RTO and you're looking like a system impact study, sometimes those can take 3 to 6 months for a system impact study. Sometimes, and for a transmission study, the same kind of thing. The cost on those, typically depending on the RTO, there's a set fee to submit a project into a system impact study and have that done. What typically the RTOs will do is take your project and lump it in with a series of projects that are underway or proposed also, and they will look at the impact of all of those at the same time on the system. So that's one of the reasons it takes some time. I think the queue in MISO right now is, I would say, in excess of 6 months to get that done. The fees, that's something you'd have to contact MISO with, because I'm not exactly sure what the fee is right now. It's not onerous to get it done, but it's not insubstantial. What can cost can cost a lot of money is once you get the results of the system impact study, depending on what your project, how your project impacts the system, the cost of upgrades, depending on how many projects, that mix of projects they're evaluating, and they look at the shared cost for the needed upgrades to manage that. And that is very unpredictable. You wouldn't know that until after the system impact study. So I can't really give you a cost on that because it depends on the projects, and a number of different projects come together.
And I think I would also just add, I mean, it can be costly, and therefore, before you have to be very sure that you want to do this. And so that means step one, understanding and deciding that you want to go after a large utility scale project. And then step two is what business model do you want as it relates to that large utility scale project? Are you just looking at land lease payments? What type of ownership structure you want? What partners do you want on that project? And so those are less costly, making those decisions. And I think Lizana brought up at the beginning of this webinar, this Tribal Energy Atlas is a really cool tool to see your overall energy resource on tribal land. So using that tool, looking at that, and seeing if a large utility scale project is right for you is the first step.
Right.
And then you'll eventually get to the point where you're confident there is a project there, and that's when you start reserving the funds for those, pre-development activities, to get you to the point where you can respond to one of these RFPs or issue a reverse RFP to find buyers.
Right, and just to be clear, those interconnection and system impact costs, if that project is really attractive to a utility, they're going to partner with the tribe on those costs because those system benefits system upgrades, if that's going to benefit a particular system, they're going to want to help you with that also. They're going to want to pay for a lot of that if that particular project creates great benefit for them and fits their integrated resource plan very well. So it's not as if a tribe would have to absorb the entire cost of that. It might, but that may not be the case.
Got it. Great. Thanks, guys. So no other questions on the docket here. So with that, we will move towards wrapping up the webinar today. Thanks so much to all of the speakers. Great presentations today. I appreciate your time in preparing those and providing them. Generally, we are very interested in your suggestions on how to strengthen the value of this webinar series and training. So please provide that. We do have a list here on your screen of the remaining webinars in the 2018 series. The next one is Utility Scale Energy Development, and it will be held on August 29th at 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thanks again for everyone's interest and attendance today. Have a good day. Bye-bye.